ジョン・リチャーズさんは、リー・ランディさんと同じように、モンフォート大学の教員をされています。で特に、ダーティー・エレクトロニクスというアイデアですね。それは、共有する、実験ですとか、ジェスチャー、そして、ソーシャルインタラクションですね。そういったものを、扱うような分野です。で、私はまだその分野分かってないので、今日は一生懸命聞こうと思いますけれども、でですね、初期的には、非常に大人数の電子音楽で、それで DIY エレクトロニクスという概念を今日ご紹介していただきます。Do it yourself。それで、音楽制作なんですけれども、Creating Music Inside Electronics ですね。電子の中の、で音楽を作ると。で、彼の仕事はまた、パフォーマンスアート、舞台芸術と、電子音楽、そしてグラフィックデザイン、あるいはそれらの学術的な学際的なですね、分野というものに、境界を置かずにやっているというところですね。ダーティーエレクトロニクスは、移植されてですね、音楽デバイスですね、いろいろな、アートの組織とか、フェスティバル、そういったものがリリース、ミュートレコーズで、ハンドヘルドシンスのシリーズが、リリースされていますと。ジョン・リチャーズさんは、アンドリュー・フーギルさんとリー・ランディさんと、同僚ということで、モンフォート大学で、ミュージックテクノロジー・イノベーション・リサーチセンターで、勤めていますということです。で今日はその辺のコンセプトをしっかり聞きたいと思います。Yes, please start. But 1 hour is good to you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just try and stick to the paper that I wrote. I do have lots of other examples, and if there's time we can look at some of those. The idea of music of things is something I've been increasingly concerned with. This has been for the purpose of defining my own practice as dirty electronics and the broader field of DIY electronic music, or what I've termed maker music. You can read about maker music in this recent publication, Electronic Music, which is published by Cambridge University Press, which is being published this year. My main interest has been in instrumental music. And by this I mean electronic music that is not necessarily studio-based, but centres around performance. I'd like to interject at this point and just play a few examples of the music that I've been making, and also give a very few examples of my work as dirty electronics. So this is just a short excerpt from a piece which is available online actually via the Wire magazine website. This piece is called Spattercan, and in many ways characterises the sound world of the music that I'm interested in. Likely the music I tend to explore is sound-based. Some people do call me a noise musician, but I'd rather call it sound-based music. So this is an excerpt of a piece of music recorded in 2011. sounds I enjoy. And I've also been involved in making circuit boards, PCBs. And some of these have become products by accident. And here's an example of one of those PCBs. At the end of the talk, I've got some postcards here. You can take one, and there are lots of designs that I've worked on which you can look at and listen to. And for me, they're not just about creating a synthesizer or something that you make necessarily, but they kind of represent a composition in its own right through an object. So the object is, in many ways, the work. I tend not to record some of the music I make, but produce these things. Some of them are more experimental in shape and form, whilst others are manufactured. So there is quite a crossover between art and science. My background is as a musician. In fact, I was taught by Trevor Wishart at York University. I studied music there. And I've been interested in electronic sound, and most of the technology that I've picked up along the way has been self-taught. But I do straddle the two cultures, both technological and arts. Lots of my work also involves inviting people to participate. You could call them workshops, where I would design something that would be made in situ with a large group. And I've done many of these workshops all over the world. In fact, this is my second visit to Japan as Dirty Electronics, and Say here invited me to do a workshop in 2009, I believe now, quite a long time ago. So this is something very important to my work. It's not just about me taking part in this, but working in large groups and sometimes creating performances with some of the participants who make these things. Let's get back to the paper. Much of my practice has been informed by institutions such as Stein in the Netherlands, and also you could say it's represented by the Conference 9, which I've put some links up there. I've also kind of accidentally been involved in interaction design, and I've been a guest lecturer at the Royal College of Art on their Information Experience Design course. And also worked very closely with Adrian Shaughnessy, who's a lecturer in graphic design at the Royal College of Art. Some of the circuit boards that I have worked on and made have been collaborations with various people, and Adrian Shaughnessy has been one of those collaborators. But these interests have only served as a starting point to develop an aesthetic of a music of things. Some of the key points of this aesthetic have been exploring the relationship between performance and composition, composing inside electronics, as expressed by David Schuder, and by extension, instrument as composition, and the deconstruction of musical instrument, or more accurately, investigating along the continuum from instrument to object to thing. This talk, however, will focus on three areas relating to this aesthetic of a music of things: making music through the fundamental exploration of electronic components, solder, wires, and electricity itself; 2, instrument as a collection of interconnectable things rather than a self-contained entity. And 3, making as a processual part of performance. Many of the ideas presented in this talk also form the basis of an in preparation co-authored book with Lee Landy, which Lee mentioned earlier, with the title On the Music of Sounds and the Music of Things. So let's look at point 1, making music through the fundamental exploration of electronic components, solder, wires and electricity itself. I've previously written about hobbyist electronics and its impact on music, the book that I referred to earlier. In that chapter, I talk about how electronic components were used after World War II by, for example, Robert Moog in his synthesizer designs. And that's also discussed by Trevor Pinch and Frank Trocco. The development of the transistor and integrated circuits also led to a boom in hobbyists' electronics. There were also a very large number of monthly magazines with schematics and how-tos, particularly from the 1960s onwards, in the US and the UK, 2 examples being Practical Electronics and Popular Electronics. There are also a number of other European publications, and there was also a Japanese computer magazine called I.O. that published schematics and of DIY synthesizers. That was published in the 1970s. Also, there were a number of authors writing in English who helped popularize electronics that did have an impact on many musicians. And I've mentioned just a few in that Cambridge chapter. 3 here: Forrest Mims, Donald Lancaster and Craig Anderton. So in many ways they broke down this technological language or opened up electronics to the layperson, to amateurs who wanted to explore electronics from a practical point of view. This in many ways opened up lots of possibilities for musicians. Electronic music was not necessarily restricted to the recording studio, as some history books have us believe. For example, the idea of, for example, in France and Germany, the 2 national studios have been seen as being hugely influential in terms of electronic music history. But electronic music could be made at a fundamental level of the component within electronics. Musicians began to take advantage of these resources. David Tudor, the American musician and composer in particular, highlighted the potential of a music conceived out of the material nature of wires and the electronic circuit. Both Ron Kuvela and Nicholas Collins have written informatively on the work of David Tudor in this regard. The spirit of composing inside electronics fostered by David Tudor also continued in the work of the Sonic Arts Union, Robert Ashley, David Berman, Alvin Lucier and Gordon Mummer, and can also be found in Collins's edited Leonardo Music Journal and Nicholas Collins' seminal book Handmade Electronic Music, The Art of Hardware Hacking. But this new musical philosophy was not exclusive to the US. For example, taking a UK-centric position, the works of Hugh Davies also exemplify this exploration of electronic music at a fundamental level. Let's think about the here and now and more recent developments in electronic music. At the turn of the millennium, terms such as post-digital began to emerge, along with a resistance to a purely digital music. A need for more pluralistic approaches to working with technology and hybridization emerged. Laurie Anderson's quote, "There is not enough dirt in virtual reality," stayed with me and captures this view. I too took a lead from Anderson in defining my own work as dirty electronics, getting the hands dirty in a physical electronic music. Digital technology only seemed to underline the role of the body, either through questioning the body's existence or redundancy in performance. Ironically, the internet not only offered opportunities for new digital music making, but also emphasised technologies of the past. So, for example, marketplaces such as eBay only emphasised old technologies through having images, for example, of old synthesizers or valve amplifiers that ultimately became collectible. Analog became fashionable, a discussion beyond the scope of this talk. This return to the analog was more than just nostalgia. A generation of musicians have been brought up on virtual instruments and studios, and they wanted the real thing. And with the real thing came a cachet and a sense of authenticity about the resulting music. So this post-digital ethos and analog revival coincided with the growth of new maker communities. To be brief, I'll call this DIY-ness. Maker fairs, crafting, hack and fab labs all capture this DIY-ness that has not always been rooted in making finished stuff. I've sometimes asked, what are we actually all making? But such a question fails to recognise the importance of making for making's sake, and the act of making as a political statement. The mindfulness of crafting is also an important factor. Making can be seen as a radical movement that seeks to readdress society from the ground up, a way of empowering individuals and self-determination. If we can all make, then we can own it. To return to a more specific point about music, a DIY electronic music instinctively addresses issues of access and engagement, two of the big themes in Lee and my book on the music of sound and the music of things. DIY, or more specifically DIT, do it together, or DIWU, do it with others, where people would have workshops, modular synth meets and participatory events have become commonplace. This making spirit that I've referred to has therefore fueled the idea of electronic instrument as a collection of wires and components, and that is something to be made. This brings me to my second point. The act of making in a DIY electronic music context serves to underline that instrument is a collection of interconnectable things. But before we look at music of things in more detail, it is worth exploring the continuum of instrument, object and thing that I highlighted in the introduction. I've often considered an object-orientated approach to music making with particular reference to John Cage. Cage remarked, "Object would become process. We would discover, thanks to a procedure borrowed from science, the meaning of nature through the music of objects." When discussing such object-orientated approaches, I've stated it is not simply a case of just playing these objects as instruments, but of exploring these properties at a fundamental level, exploring their properties at a fundamental level. In many instances, repertoire is found in the object rather than played on the instrument. In addition, I've made tentative links to object-orientated ontology as expressed by Levi Bryant. But an object suggests something that is clearly demarcated, with discernible boundaries, stable and self-contained. However, in the performance of DIY electronic music, the idea of objecthood is often broken down. So I've included this image here, messy tabletops. This is a an image by Yuka Hackerman, and in many ways typifies the DIY sound table. And this idea of instrument, as you can see, is broken down, and we are thinking of in terms of sound making through the interconnection of multiple things. An instrument of electronic, therefore, implies a disposition towards processes, connectivity and relationships, how things may or may not interact with each other. These are issues I've returned to again and again in my own practice and research, but for this talk I'd like to present some of my more recent ideas surrounding the deconstruction of object in performance. George Macunis, founder of the Fluxus movement, has been cited as saying Fluxus grew out of vaudeville, Charlie Chaplin and surrealism, junk art, world's fairs and Walt Disney, ready-mades, futurist theatre and Wagnerism. In true Fluxus spirit, some of these attributions may be bogus, but the idea of object play and transformation and the ready-made action, as presented by George Breck, are certainly evident in the films of Charlie Chaplin. It was interesting that Lee brought up Charlie Chaplin in his talk earlier on, and in many ways thinking about performing with objects and looking at the work of Charlie Chaplin has been very influential in my own work. Certainly there is humour, which somebody mentioned earlier, but Chaplin is particularly good at this idea of object transformation, and I thought I'd play and show a few examples of some of these object transformations from one of Chaplin's films. This is his film 1 AM, where Chaplin portrays a drunk who returns home and mistakes a number of different objects for different things. Particularly the cigarette and the match get featured in this film. So, for example, he would light a match, light the cigarette, blow out the cigarette and try and smoke the match. This kind of reversal of the function of the object is a particularly strong feature of Chaplin's work. And in many ways, through doing this, the idea of objecthood is deconstructed. He creates new relationships between these things. So let's just play a couple of examples to show you that. This is a silent movie, so there will be no language issues. So the entire film features these play with objects, where things become other things. Chapter. So that's from the film. That's from the film 1 a.m. So other objects in the film are also transformed. A decanter stopper becomes a pepper or salt pot. A coat stand becomes a ladder. A bathtub becomes a bed. And the round table occupies an important position in the film, both physically in the centre of the hallway and as a key prop. The table that spins seems to represent Chaplin's state of mind and drunkenness, and adds to the flux and transformation of the objects in the room. It becomes an object mixer, this table. Objects are put down as one thing but picked up as another. The spinning also provides a ready-made action. Chaplin finds himself on the table, walking, running. He's a bit like a hamster or a mouse on a treadmill. More ready-made actions involve the 2 flights of stairs in the room. The affordance of stairs, walking up and down, is played upon with theme and variation. Falling down the stairs backwards, sliding, rolling, rolled up in the stair carpet, and with other objects. For example, with a stuffed bear is performed. The stairs become such an obstacle that they are transformed into a mountain by Chaplin becoming a mountaineer in full regalia, hat, backpack, rope and pick. It is only through the transformation of one object to another, as previously mentioned, a coat becomes a ladder, that Chaplin eventually gets to the top of the stairs and the first floor. Before I leave Chaplin, I'd like to discuss his use of the technological object in his films. In 1 a.m, Chaplin is confronted by what appears to be a state-of-the-art retractable bed. The bed is hidden behind a panel, and Chaplin is presented with a set of buttons on the wall and the dilemma of which button to press to retract the bed. What follows is an object gag based on not only object play, 1001 ways to get into a bed, but technology failing. Try as he might, Chaplin fails, and the technology fails to make a bed. Similarly, technology fails magnificently in Modern Times, another film which features Chaplin, where Chaplin finds himself subjected to an automatic feeding machine and its glitches. The machine is archetypally, to use a British saying, Heath Robinson, a completely impractical and overly complicated device. Let's go on to the final point. And when describing my own practice, I often state performance begins on the workbench and is extended onto the stage. This has become like my motto. The relationship between the making of musical instrument, sound devices, and performing has been an ongoing theme in my work, as well as providing a rich vein for further research. Such a preoccupation illustrates my attempt to consider how to make sound making and what to do with sound performing as a holistic practice. Yet I've continued to scrutinise the relationship between performance, workbench and stage. So when coming to my final point, making as a processual part of performance, the distinction between these terms becomes blurred. After all, the performance space can become the workbench, or the performance can become the act of live making. Process of making and process music become one and the same. There are precedents for making as a procedural part of performance in some of the early Fluxus works. For example, Alison Knowles's propositions, or proposition 2, is based on a simple event score with the instructions, make a salad. And her variation on this, make a soup. Both of these event scores present making as the work and involve ready-made actions. I've also previously discussed the practice of making circuits on the spot, live soldering, an example being the performances of the group Loud Objects, and drawn parallels between the field of live coding. Then there is the Japanese group, the Breadboard Band, who take a prototypical approach to constructing circuits in performance. In my own work, the idea of making as a performance became acute in the Dirty Electronics Solder a Score in 2011. That was part of Live Weekends, Notation and Interpretation at the ICA, the Institute of Contemporary Art in London. The making and performance took place in the main lower gallery of the ICA over the duration of a week. Gallery attendees were able to watch the construction of circuits as if a living installation. At this stage, I could discuss some of these performances and events in more detail. However, I want to focus on something topical and related to my more current work. As part of this visit to Japan, I'll collaborate with sound artist Kanta Horio to create a participatory event for the Sapporo International Arts Festival. This is going to be the week after next. I'd previously worked with Kanta in the UK and Japan. His work combines light and sound and the exploration of objects. I like to think of his work as bringing to life inanimate objects through generating electromagnetic fields. Through the movement and vibration of objects, sound is made. Kanta's work falls into the category of what could be called performance installation. This year's Sapporo International Arts Festival has been guest directed by Otama Yoshida, whose aim was to put together a citizen participatory art festival where attendees are invited to just get hands-on to create something with each other and see what comes of it. Many of the works and commissions for the festival are site-specific and seek to engage specifically with the local community. Kanta Horio has been commissioned to create an installation for the festival in an abandoned building in the neon-lit entertainment district of Susukino. And this is where we will also stage our collaboration. Some of the floors in the multi-storey building are without electricity, and there is a very dark windowless basement. Here are just a few photographs of the space. As well as responding to the character of the building and its electrical wiring and infrastructure, being in situ, making in light or the absence of light became the starting point for our collaboration. I also wanted to investigate some of the core themes of my current work, namely making as a procedural part of performance. We too put together a simple event score and some propositions for the work. Here we have this event score. Darkness, a room without a window. Make a sound circuit. This will be in the dark. Blow into a whistle to generate electric current, light and sound. A collective performance. And the propositions: what happens when darkness descends on our workbench and mains electricity becomes scarce and precious? We had a few ideas for titles. Nocturne, night music was an obvious one. Night birds, but we eventually chose the simple title of Dark Electronics. I'd explored similar themes in the past, such as the Dirty Electronics Ugly Weekender, where DIY circuits were made in candlelight. But these works are not concerned with light and darkness per se, but how such limitations highlight the process of making and change the relationship with materials, tools, and other participants. The absence of light also naturally diminishes visual cues and emphasizes the senses of sound and touch. This heightened experience could be thought of as a form of acousmatic making. So this is the instrument that we will build with 15 participants in Sapporo the week after next. I was hoping to physically show you this, but my luggage didn't make it to Japan. That is coming tonight, hopefully. But I do have some images and a video of this device. So it's powered, electric current is created through blowing into it. And I used, actually it's a generator for a water pump, which you normally attach to a water pump. And it's just about possible to blow into this to create enough current to power a circuit. I quite like this idea of the power source being dynamic. Many of the electronic devices that we use, the idea of the power, apart from battery life, but it's regulated. This idea that the power in any way can fluctuate is often seen as a bad thing. When you have some kind of fluctuating power supply, this can, in the case of an electronic circuit, be very dynamic. It becomes, in many ways, like the energy flow of the device. And by using large capacitors, which kind of act as temporary batteries, it's possible to change the sustain, if you like, or the decay of the sounding circuit. So simply by adding different size capacitors, you can create different trajectories, different phrases, if you like. This also has a plastic bag attached to the end of it. This is my simple way of visualizing a breath, to physically put some kind of object on the end of this instrument. And it's also, again, somewhat humorous. These bags will glow as well. So as you blow into them, light will also be generated. So put yourself in a dark basement in Sapporo with 15 musicians in the dark trying to perform with these instruments. The resulting sound is quite complex due to the... What, Charlie? It's crushed. You won't stop. Look at that. Charlie Chaplin forever. Okay, right. Here we go. I'll play that again, why not? So I quite, instead of putting switches on it, I quite like this idea of an open circuit design. So it's used, the circuit is built using nails and wire wrapping, and the crocodile clips enable you to make different connections live. So it's a way of reconfiguring the circuit rather than having a printed circuit board or something that's permanently fixed. This large capacitor here, as you could hear, one breath actually creates quite a lot of charge and lasts for a number of seconds. It takes a while to actually charge a capacitor, so you blow and you get some silence, and then eventually you get then the discharging as the current gradually dissipates. And then you can use your hand as well over the speaker. So this is also designed with the idea that it will be made in the dark. So it's meant to be difficult. This is the challenge. And to summarise the rest of my talk here, the kind of idea of doing things slowly is very important in a world of technology. So I talk about in the paper slow movement and slow tech. And again, I refer to a paper that's recently been published, Slippery Bows and Slow Circuits. So this idea of thinking of technology not in terms of optimization and efficiency, but as something that can be made slowly. In many ways, this makes the approach closer to craft. And I talk about a particular reference to David Pye, and this idea that in craft there is always the idea of risk, that things can go wrong. You're making a pot, and maybe you push too hard, and the pot collapses. Or you're doing calligraphy, and the pen slips. And in this event in Sapporo, maybe only one person takes home a finished instrument. I also talk about how I've become critical of my own work. Some of these beautiful circuit boards that I've made have become like products. And often people aren't so interested in the more experimental nature of these products. They simply are possessive. They want the object, they take it home. You could call it some kind of materialism of sorts, which is very indicative of the, I suppose, the capitalist world in which we live in. Consumerism. So this also is an attempt to critique this idea of consumerism, that the workshop will be more experiential rather than about making something to take home. And in the paper I've talked about this idea of to do or to have, and I cite a particular paper there in the paper. I'll get back to it. Just to finish off here, I've got a couple more things. Yes, so I mentioned this particular paper. This is online, so you can download this. In fact, all of the things I've mentioned are readily available on the internet and can be read or downloaded. And the slow movement and slow tech, and two particular references in the paper that I refer to. And then this particular paper that I find inspiring, To Do or to Have. That's by Bovin and Gilovich, which was published in 2003. So I've started doing a few more of these events rather than things to take home. Recently I did a performance in Denmark, and it was called The Construct Has No Purpose. Again, so this invited people to make stuff, but deliberately provide nothing for these people to take home at the end of the workshop. So let's just finish off here. I've mentioned the David Pye writings on craftsmanship and this sense of risk that's very important. I've often referred to Brian Eno as well and his idea of oblique strategies. I enjoy making things difficult in performance, but this could also be applied to the making process. It doesn't have to be easy. We can make things that are challenging. Not necessarily technologically, but simply by thinking of what sort of limitations we can impose on that certain situation. I'd like to draw together some additional themes of the piece with Cantahorio. Simon Schafer, in his recent BBC documentary, Mechanical Marvels, Clockwork Dreams, discussed the incredible craftsmanship of 18th century watchmakers and their working conditions. He talks about how artisans in the clock trades were required to undertake extremely small and detailed work, often in candlelight. Dark Electronics with Cantahorio is a tribute to such hand skills and a celebration of manual labour. The preconditions of the event in Sapporo will also force the simplification of circuit design and constructs. And this form of reductionism is also an attempt to reveal the very essence of the work. Finally, constructing a circuit in such conditions will require the help of other participants. And this ultimately places an emphasis on DIT, do it together, rather than DIY, which has become central to my practice as dirty electronics. Thank you.
Are there any questions, discussion? Please. Personally, I am new to this field because I am, as a composer, always I use the either ready-made instrumental sound or recorded sound.
Yes.
So if you say in the chapter 3, interconnectable things, if you connect things, I'm thinking about the reproducibility of music.
Yes.
And if you are a member of, say, 9, or you deal with things, always you're dealing with a new thing. And it's, to me, not you yourself personally, but the area, field themselves, are very new to, so it's like a performance, even you're a creator, and reproducing seems to be very, very difficult.
Yes, I think this is a really good point. I've had a discussion with Marcel Vanderlei, who is on the committee of 9, where you, in my practice, it comes to a point where I'm not really designing instruments anymore because of this very issue about reproducing something. And my efforts are not to reproduce. It's only a process, which I've talked about, which becomes repeatable, not the actual thing itself. And this idea that this kind of making is a kind of composition rather than an instrument. And in many ways, this idea of reproducing something is also at the heart of this, because you can't reproduce necessarily, or somebody else won't reproduce the same sounds with that instrument or object or things. So it brings a very different way of thinking about writing music, because instrument is no longer stable, no longer reproducible. So how do I write music for this type of approach?
No, I don't try to say things that music should be such and such, but simply I want to consider about the characteristic of what you were doing, that the characteristic of music that you were dealing with. So you say the process of making things, just sort of music, you're saying. Is that right? No?
They are one and the same, yes. Part of the same circle.
And it seems that the 9 people in general are always developing things, and they probably never fix up to a certain point.
Yes.
They are alive, everyday change. So the music itself is like improvisation, and it's a snapshot of the performance at that very time.
Yes.
Is this understanding right?
Yeah. I very much come from an improvisation background, and I think this is it's true that.
So rather than saying reproducibility, but a record, the record, like Chaplin's movie.
Yes.
Recording is very important, and the snapshot of that time, you created this music, which is very interesting. It's recorded forever, like, yeah, that's...
It's quite interesting how you document these things. So for me, some of the documents have been the objects themselves, rather than the recordings.
But my question is, in, say, classical type of music, still there's an improvisation and fixed music.
Yes.
So this field as well, should be improvisation in general, but
yes,
can be a fixed one, so that you can reproduce not all the pieces, but I wonder if there should be some sort of fixed style, like paper.
So yes, I have to look at other ways to fix it. So in the case of this instrument, there's a schematic. So the schematic serves as a way of reproducing not the music per se, but the starting point, or maybe the idea there will be a video on YouTube, there will be some photographs. So the actual document becomes problematic in terms of even the idea of score or recording don't fully represent what is taking place. So there is the object, there will be the schematics, so somebody could reproduce the object. Of course, that doesn't make me a rich man, and it's not really my music. In many ways, I'm giving it to somebody else to finalise. The authorship becomes shared somehow. I only provide a seed, which is a start, and then other people make their music with it, which is a very different proposition, because I have a PhD in composition with Trevor, which somebody mentioned earlier, and I think at the moment I got my PhD in composition, I ceased to be a composer. That was 20 years ago. And I tend to make things now which are more unstable, or what's the Japanese? Improvisatory, or not fixed, impermanent, ephemeral.
流動的な。まあ、いわば私は門外漢からの質問でしたが、もうちょっと類似した分野でやっている方がコメント、意見、質問とありませんか？類似の近い、もうトップ下の方。北さん、そうですよね。新しいような質問でもちょっとつまんないから。
He said somebody who has a similar research field should make a question, but I'm not sure. But I'm very curious about your performance, or this kind of drafting some analog circuit to produce some very interesting sound. I'm curious about the process of this. How can I say? Of making this circuit, or
yes.
how do you let them make circuit in the workshop. You did workshop, right?
Yes.
In Sapporo, you said.
Yeah.
And each of them made this kind of circuit, right?
This exactly. Yeah.
I see. So from scratch, from nothing, they made this kind of
Yes.
instrument. All right. So how many percentage of people were successful in finally generating the sound?
I think at this point, if I have 5 minutes, I should show you some examples, just pictures of some workshops, very quickly. Let me just show you this. Yes. Let's go to... Let's have a quick look at some of these. I'll just flick through a few of these and stop at somewhere. So sometimes we would make things and then work out how to perform with them. I particularly like that approach. Almost the making serves as a form of analysis. You become more aware of the sound maker. It makes you change your relationship with the thing that you make sound with. And then you think about how you might perform with these objects. Sometimes I appropriate objects. So this is a pair of scissors attached to a motor. This was quite an interesting workshop, and this was a yoke tie across here, and you can only play it by rocking. So again, a deliberately restrictive, an instrument that you can't play. I quite like designing bad instruments. This is my interesting inspirations here. Wobbly Instrument. These are books you stand on and you wobble. So this idea that you can't quite control what you're doing, because a good instrument you can control. I like things that, in many ways, offer their own control. So, in this case, imbalance is a particular feature of this work. But let's get to some workshops, or thinking of deliberately challenging ways to play the instrument. What happens if the instrument is just slightly out of reach, too far away? How can I play the instrument? So this idea of oblique strategies, I'm also now trying to introduce into the making process as well. What happens if I try to make an instrument with all the wrong tools? Or if I forget a soldering iron? And then often some of the workshops involve performances, some very unusual instruments. This interactive synthesizer was made with a sheep's fleece. Some feathers that vibrated. And then sometimes a festival will want an artifact. Something to remember the workshop, and sometimes to generate income or sell. So I've designed a lot of printed circuit boards. Some of them have become quite sophisticated in terms of PCB design. These circuit boards are manufactured in China. So this is at the other extreme. This becomes more fixed at this point. It becomes more stable, more like an instrument. But in some of these instruments, I try to carry on similar themes, like this idea of a deliberately windy circuit, which is the last thing you're meant to do in electronic design. You're meant to make the connection as short as possible. So, just artistic. Or deliberately messy things. Let's not make it logical. And these things obviously become more sculptural. All these instruments have been designed for workshops. Sometimes people even respond to the circuits through other art forms. So this is an interpretation of a circuit through costume and photography. Even a menu that was based on a circuit. We had a grant from the Arts Council of England, and I spent the money on a baker, a chef, who designed food for the event based on the schematic, which was rather fun. This is the event I was talking about in Denmark. So we just built something in a corridor, and then made sound in the corridor. Sometimes I create like a banquet for soldering, and people come, and this is in Croatia, experimenting with circuits, working with lots of different participants. Sometimes the workshops can be very large. So this will change my design process. Someone will say, can you design something for 50 people, which can be made in 2 hours? So that changes the composition or the design ethos or the resulting music. Then sometimes we work on group performances together. In China, quite recently. Sometimes in nightclubs, sometimes in concert halls, sometimes in universities. That's one particular thing which next week in Sapporo at an arts festival. So my work isn't exclusively for universities, although I am interested in research of some of these approaches. But a lot of the ideas are applied. So these ideas are taken out into the broader community. And then some of the objects can be more free. This is a work of another artist, but let's move on. Sometimes they can be appropriated from other devices. So my commission tends to be like a circuit board. So instead of writing a score, the phone will ring and I will design a special object for the festival. And I'm now getting old, and so there have been lots of these commissions, so many different circuit boards with all different ideas and visual inspirations as well, sometimes collaboration. Sometimes they have a visual element, and this one had a screen made from a 7-segment display. I'm getting more and more into hybrid devices that are both digital and analog. So they have a PIC microprocessor, which is programmed, that controls analog sounds. And then this idea that you can compose with the code and then store that on the object itself. Tristan Parrish has done a number of compositions using PIC chips. I've shown this is an early example, this is an all analog device, but this was a collaboration with a record company. Mute Records, groups like Depeche Mode or Nick Cave, Moby, Goldfrapp. I think this happened after the last time I came to Japan, but this did change my life a little bit. I started getting invited to bigger festivals and then reaching out to a wider audience. Recently I've also worked with a graphic designer, Jack Featherstone, there he is, who designs t-shirts, mainly for the record label Warp Records, who are mainly known for releasing music by Aphex Twin, for example, electronica. So we've recently designed another series of objects all very graphical. This is a hybrid, part digital, part analog device. So that's a little bit of how I've been working at finding a way to, back to Natoshi's question about how you then disseminate the music if it's always never finished. And certainly some of the circuits have been in a kind of way, and the workshops. So there's the idea of a participatory event, and the objects themselves become the music. The process and the objects, rather than a recording of the music or a score in some way. A rather long answer to the question. I'm sorry.
And the point of my question is, how can I say, if your instruments are very bad, the audience should manage to kind of say, reach out the sound for sound or for good achievement. They experience a good, how can I say, very I can say a good experience. So
Yes.
that's could be some sort of I can say musical experience, or at least enhance the musical experience. So
Yes.
so, and my I can say interest is also for how can I say, I'd like my piece to be joinable. How can I say?
Enjoyable?
Yeah, I like my audience to join my piece,
Yes.
but to experience my piece. That's why I stick to the small devices,
Yes.
to I guess portable devices. So so your talk is very inspiring and instructive to me. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this smallness is important for me as well. Rather than designing a really large synthesizer with lots of, there's something about it being at hand, you know, maybe inspired by, dare I say it, the mobile technologies that we have. There's something beautiful in that kind of ubiquitous kind of technology, something that's readily available. Most of these things are quite cheap as well, even the more exotic looking circuit boards here. It is, access is an important thing.
Okay, thank you very much. We are almost
Yeah.
out of time, so we would like to conclude the talk. Thank you very much.
Anybody like a postcard?
日本に戻りますけど、じゃあ、ゲストの講演を終わりまして、今日の研究会をこれで終わりたい